Welcome to Calgary Conversations, a podcast of the City of Calgary where we aim to have frank conversations with city leaders about the issues and topics impacting Calgarians.
Please stand behind the yellow line.
My name is Jose Rodriguez. I am the leader of Media Relations and Employee Communications at the City, and I'm happy to be your host. Welcome back to Calgary Conversations, and today we're going to talk about assessment, and we're fortunate enough to have our city assessor, Eddie Lee, with us. Eddie, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So it's obviously a topic every year. It's a very important topic for Calgarians. Can you just explain, how does tax assessment work? How do you set a value on my home?
Yeah. So what property assessment is all about is placing a value on a property for fair and equitable property tax distribution. And what we look at when we value a property is, the sort of the same things any homeowner would have looked at when they first bought their home. We would be looking at the property characteristics. So things would come into play such as, location, the size of the home, whether it backs onto a park or backs onto Deerfoot Trail. All of those factors that we consider into your assessment. The other thing we would look at is sales of recent properties. So each year we look at the assessed value or the market value as of July 1st of the previous year. So for the assessments that we just mailed, that would be July 1st of 2024. And no different than when you first made an offer on the property that you purchased, you'd be looking at the sales that have recently occurred of similar properties. So we take all of that sales information and the property characteristics information to pinpoint what that market value would have been on July 1st, 2024.
So is that what would explain why one property in the same neighborhood as a similar property might have a different assessment? They could have a brick upgrade, or they've redone the kitchen in marble, or whatever it is. Is that the reasons that the homes would be different?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the outside, they might look very similar, but there could be little differences. A common one would be renovations or even the size of the home, right? The square footage could vary even though they might look similar from the outside.
So Eddie, one thing that I've always wondered is, how do we come to what the final bill is for Calgarians? So for this household, what goes into that final bill?
There's actually three factors with comes to property taxes. One is the amount of revenues that the city needs, the amount of revenues that the province needs, and property assessments. So let's talk about the revenues that the city needs. So that has been set back in November. So overall, we're looking at a 3.6% property tax increase. And that means 5.5% for residential and 1.4% for non-residential. And the reason why there's
the mix of those two is what gives us the 3.6, right?
That's right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and the reason why there's that difference is Council this year, again, as part of a 3-year plan, has shifted 1% in non-residential property tax to residential property tax to better balance the distribution between homeowners and businesses. So even with that 1% shift, business owners will see their property taxes 4.6 times the amount on the same assessed value. So if your home went up the typical 15%, you would be paying that 5.5% tax increase. So that second component is with regards to the provincial portion. So that portion is still unknown right now. So we won't know that until the province passes its budget, expected at the end of February or beginning of March. And then we will then have our final budget required numbers. And that last piece is around assessment. And we have those assessment values that we just mailed at the beginning of January. And that value is based upon what your home would have sold for as of July 1st, 2024.
We talk a little bit about what that goes to fund. What gets funded out of our, people's property tax each year?
Yeah, so for residential property taxes, roughly a third of it goes to the province. So that helps to fund public education. The second biggest component is around public safety. So that's about roughly 19% of residential property tax, and that goes towards police, fire, bylaw services as an example. The third biggest bucket where your property taxes help fund is around transportation. So that includes, transit, roads, pathways, sidewalks, those sorts of things.
Do we keep track of, which years receive more appeals than other years, and where are we tracking this year, or is it too early to tell?
Right now, it's too early to tell. Last year, we had roughly around 2,500 assessment complaints, and that is roughly 99.5% of property owners did not file a complaint.
Just because my house was worth $600,000 and now is worth $900,000 doesn't mean the city is collecting a whole bunch more money overall. Is that right?
That's correct. So any revenue changes, how much money that the city needs to collect, is transparently communicated through the budgetary process. So this year, council had an overall increase of 3.6% in property taxes, and that translated to 5.5% for residential and 1.4% for non-residential. And part of the reason why there's that difference is one of the things that we are trying to do is try to rebalance the property tax distribution between residential property owners and businesses. Currently, businesses pay about 4.6 times the amount of tax on the exact same for every dollar of assessed value.
And we did make a change this year and the previous year, right? To put less of a strain on non-residential.
That's right.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, is it 1% each year? Is that?
Yeah. So last year we transferred 1% of the share from non-residential property owners to residential, and we did the same again this year.
And basically what that means is if I'm running a business, I would not pay as much as I would have paid had we not made this change.
Yeah, that's correct. So if we didn't make that change, average business owner would see a 3.6% tax increase, but because of that shift, they're seeing a 1.4% increase on average.
There's different classes, am I right? There's industrial and then there's non-residential. Can you explain the classes and what those entail?
Yeah, so in Calgary, there are 3 classes, and each class, there's a different tax rate. So there's residential, non-residential, and farmland. So some people think that there may be different tax rates within, say, residential, that there might be a different tax rate for, say, single detached and condos. In Calgary, there is only one tax rate. However, within residential, there are lots of different types of properties. You've got your single detached, you got your semi-detached, you got condos, you got big apartment complexes. One thing that we did note this year is that there was a difference in how those values changed. So overall, for residential, we saw a 15% value change. For our single detached and semi-detached homes, we saw a 14% change. And for condos, we saw an overall 22% change. And that is based upon the sales that we have seen in the marketplace. We have seen stronger demand for lower valued properties. Over the past year, we've seen really strong net migration into Calgary. Despite record housing starts, that hasn't been able to keep up with that demand in housing. And for those lower price pointed properties, we've saw a greater demand, and hence we've seen that those property values increase more.
How does the rest of this process unfold? What are the next key dates that Calgarians should know about?
So the next key date is around late February, early March, when the provincial budget comes out. So that will decide how much tax dollars the province needs from Calgarians. So after we receive that information, we'll be passing the property tax bylaw in March, which will finalize what the tax rates will be. So once we have those numbers, we will be mailing out our tax bills in May with a due date of June 30th. Property owners also have the option of signing up for our tax installment payment plan program. TIPS, that's right. So instead of making that one big lump sum payment due by June 30th, property owners have the option of breaking down those monthly payments or that big lump sum payment into 12 different smaller payments. One thing to note, it is a free service. There is no additional interest charges or admin fees or anything. It's a great way to help Calgarians sort of break down that payment.
Do we know what percentage of Calgarians are using the TIPS program at this point?
Yeah, so over 60% of Calgarians use this program. It's our most popular form of paying taxes.
Yeah, I can't think of anybody I know who's not on that program.
One thing I will also note that this January we also mailed out tip recalculations, and I sometimes get questions on, how is that calculated? So basically, it's whatever your annual property tax bill was from last year, and then for residential properties we would have added 5.5% because that was the budgeted property tax change for residential properties, and for non-residential properties that's 1.4% change. Some Calgarians may look at the differences between, what their December payment is versus their January payment. That isn't the annual change. You need to take a look at what the annual changes are to make that tax change calculation.
595,000 properties?
Yes.
Wow. That is a lot of properties. We're a very big city and growing every day. What does that growth mean for assessment?
We are seeing lots of new construction, and then that's of course one of the results of greater migration. And as I mentioned before, we are seeing record construction in terms of new housing. So more supply that we can generate, we can anticipate more affordable housing.
Eddie, there are all sorts of ways in which Calgarians can get informed about their specific taxes and the city's property taxes. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, we have a wealth of tools that we have available on our website that explains the entire assessment process, including, we're legislated to value on the July 1st, 24 date, how your property is assessed, what goes into it, the factors, those sorts of things. I understand, this is a difficult time for Calgarians. Affordability is top of mind, and our job is to observe and reflect those values. And if you have further questions, our team is there to help.
As we mentioned, Eddie, these are kind of tough times for Calgarians, and there are a whole bunch of different ways in that we're trying to get as much information to people as we can. Can you maybe touch on some of those?
Yeah, so this year we've even changed our assessment notice. We put historical information on there. We've also have a graph illustrating, how your home is comparing to the typical home changes. In addition to that, our website is a wealth of information that sort of outlines, what goes into your property assessments, what dates matter, and that is key in terms of a good property assessment system. Transparency, what your home characteristics that we've valued your home are based on, and all of the sales information. So we're doing everything we can in terms of being as open and as transparent as possible. And if there are any further concerns or questions that Calgarians have about their assessment, our team is here standing by at 403-268-2888 to help answer your questions.
And you've actually made yourself even more available through things like Ask the Assessor on Facebook Live and other things like that. Nobody likes paying their bills. Well, nobody likes paying an increase in a bill, right? Is this a way to make sure that Calgarians are understanding what this bill funds?
Absolutely. There's lots of confusion out there, and we're doing our best to try to, address any myths or set the record straight in terms of, what the tax changes are, how assessments are part of that equation, and that there's both, the city portion and the provincial portion that all plays in a role in the property taxes. And in addition to that is, what do you get from your property taxes? And it just goes back to, it basically touches every single part of your life every single day, from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. All Calgarians rely on some of those key services that we provide every day.
We all like to compare ourselves to our neighbors, and if you do some of the municipal benchmarking, Calgary comes off pretty well, doesn't it?
Yeah, when you look at residential property taxes across all of the major municipalities in Canada, there is no other jurisdiction that's lower. So we are trying to always look to do more with less with your taxes. Always balancing that level of service with affordability.
Well, Eddie, I've got to say thank you for the math lesson because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm mathematically challenged. Is there anything I forgot to ask you that you'd like to share?
One thing, there's lots of questions in terms of, how assessment impacts their taxes. And, you don't have to guess or be a mathematician to figure this out because we've got a great tool. We've got our tax calculator at calgary.ca/tax calculator. And all you need to do is punch in your assessment, and you can see the breakdown between how much goes to the city, how much goes to the province, and what all the services that are provided from those property taxes are.
And I think you can also see the assessed values of homes in and around you so that you have an idea of where you fit into the map. Am I right?
Yeah. So if you log into Assessment Search, there's even more information out there. Like I said, you could look at the property details that we've assessed your home on. You can see sales. You can see the assessed values of other homes. It's a wealth of information.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Eddie.
No, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today. As always, we value your feedback, so please reach out to us at calgaryconversations@calgary.ca and tell us what topics you'd like covered and questions you'd like answered. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to each other, and if you see someone without a smile today, give them yours. Take care.